23 Soviet women stood in formation, boots caked with mud, uniforms torn, faces pale with exhaustion. They had flown through fire. They had dropped bombs on Berlin. They had been called Stalin's falcons, the night witches, the terror of the Eastern Front. Now, surrounded by American soldiers with rifles slung over their shoulders, they waited for what every Soviet officer had warned them about: torture, humiliation, execution. Instead, a young American sergeant walked forward carrying a tray. On it, 23 bowls of vanilla ice cream. One pilot, Captain Nadia Popova, stared at the bowl placed in her hands. She whispered to the woman beside her, "This must be poison." But the sergeant was already eating from his own bowl, smiling, and in that moment, everything they had been told about the West began to crack. If you're watching from Russia, America, or anywhere across the world, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. Stories like this, raw, human, and true, deserve to be remembered. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're tuning in from. These stories matter because they remind us that even in war, humanity finds a way to break through. The Soviet Union had been at war for 4 years. From Stalingrad to Berlin, millions had died. Cities had been reduced to ash. Entire generations had been erased. And through it all, the Soviet propaganda machine had worked tirelessly to shape reality. The message was clear. The West is weak. The West is decadent. The West will fall. America, they said, was a nation on the brink of collapse. Its people were starving. Its soldiers were cowards. Its leaders were corrupt. And most importantly, its treatment of prisoners was barbaric beyond measure. Soviet soldiers were told that capture meant death, not just physical death, but spiritual annihilation. To surrender was to betray the motherland, to dishonor Stalin, to invite eternal shame upon one's family. For women, the warnings were even more severe. Female soldiers were told that Western troops would show no mercy, that rape and torture awaited anyone who fell into enemy hands. The night witches believed every word. They had no reason not to. They had lived inside the Soviet system their entire lives. They had seen what happened to those who questioned the party. They had watched neighbors disappear in the night, heard whispers of gulags and executions. So when Captain Nadia Popova and her squadron took to the skies in their fragile Po-2 biplanes, they flew with one certainty: death was preferable to capture. The night witches were not ordinary pilots. They were legends. Officially designated as the 588 Night Bomber Regiment, these women flew obsolete wood and canvas aircraft that enemy soldiers mockingly called sewing machines. But there was nothing amusing about what they accomplished. From 1942 to 1945, the night witches flew more than 30,000 combat missions. They dropped over 23,000 tons of bombs on Nazi positions. 23 of them were awarded the Hero of the Soviet Union Medal, the highest military honor. Their tactics were unconventional and terrifying. They would climb to high altitude, then cut their engines and glide silently toward German positions. The only sound was the wind whistling through their canvas wings, a sound German soldiers described as resembling a witch's broomstick. By the time the anti-aircraft gunners heard them, it was too late. Bombs were already falling. Nadia Popova was one of the best. She had flown 73 combat missions by the age of 23. She had been shot down twice and survived both times. She had watched friends die in flames, their planes disintegrating mid-air. She knew fear, but she also knew duty. In early May 1945, as the war in Europe was ending, Nadia's squadron was conducting a routine reconnaissance mission over eastern Germany. Their orders were simple: photograph enemy positions and return to base. But something went wrong. Anti-aircraft fire erupted from below. Nadia's plane was hit. The engine sputtered and died. She fought to control the descent, but the ground was coming up fast. She crashed in a field near the American lines. When she regained consciousness, American soldiers were standing over her. She tried to reach for her sidearm, but her hands were pinned. A medic was bandaging her head. Another was checking her pulse. She expected violence. She expected cruelty. Instead, one of the soldiers said in halting Russian, "You're safe now." She didn't believe him. She couldn't believe him. Over the next 3 days, Nadia was transported west, along with 22 other Soviet women who had been captured under similar circumstances. Some were pilots. Others were navigators, radio operators, gunners. All of them had been told the same thing. Do not let the Americans take you alive. But they were alive. And now they were being taken to a place called Camp Shanks. The journey was disorienting. The women were kept in a guarded transport, but they were not beaten. They were not starved. They were given water, bread, and even cigarettes. One of the younger women, a navigator named Katya Ryabova, asked the translator, "Why are they being kind to us?" The translator, a Russian-American woman in a U.S. Army uniform, smiled sadly, "Because that's what we do." Katya didn't understand. Kindness was a luxury. Kindness was a weakness. Kindness was not something that existed between enemies. But here it was, tangible and undeniable. When the trucks arrived at Camp Shanks, the women were led off in single file. The camp was enormous, rows of barracks, guard towers, fences topped with barbed wire. Nadia's heart sank. This was it. This was the prison they had been warned about. But as they walked through the gates, something felt wrong. The guards weren't shouting. The prisoners weren't cowering. In fact, the prisoners, German and Italian men mostly, were playing cards, smoking, even laughing. One German prisoner waved at them. Nadia looked away. This was a trick. It had to be. They were taken to a processing building. One by one, they were called inside. Nadia went first. She expected an interrogation. She expected to be stripped, searched, humiliated. Instead, a female American officer asked her name, her rank, and her unit. That was it. No torture, no threats, just paperwork. Then the officer said, "You'll be assigned to Barracks 7. Meals are at 0800, 1200, and 1800. There's a medical clinic if you need treatment. Any questions?" Nadia stared at her. "That's all." The officer nodded. "That's all." Outside, the other women were equally confused. Katya whispered, "Where are the chains? Where are the interrogators?" No one had an answer. That evening, they were taken to the mess hall for dinner. The smell hit them first. Rich, savory, overwhelming. Meat, real meat, bread, vegetables, butter. Nadia's stomach clenched. She hadn't smelled food like this in years. The line moved forward. A cook plopped a serving of beef stew onto her tray, then mashed potatoes, then a roll, then a pat of butter. She stared at the tray as though it might vanish. Behind her, Katya whispered, "This can't be real." They sat at a long table, silent, staring at their food. None of them ate. They were waiting for the trick, waiting for the poison, waiting for the laughter. But the American soldiers around them were eating the same food, casually, without fear. One soldier noticed their hesitation. He walked over, smiled, and took a bite of his own stew. Then he pointed at their trays and gave a thumbs up. Nadia picked up her fork. Slowly, cautiously, she took a bite. The flavor exploded on her tongue. Salt, fat, warmth. Her eyes filled with tears. Around her, the other women began to eat. Some wept openly, Others ate in silence, unable to process what was happening. This wasn't torture. This wasn't cruelty. This was dinner. After the meal, as they walked back to their barracks, Nadia felt something she hadn't felt in years. Full. But the fullness wasn't just physical. It was psychological. It was the weight of a lie collapsing. That night, lying on a clean cot under a wool blanket, Nadia stared at the ceiling and thought about everything she had been told. America is weak. America is cruel. America is the enemy. But if that was true, why had they fed her? Why had they given her a bed? Why had they treated her wounds? She didn't have answers, only questions. The next morning, the women were called to the recreation yard. They walked outside, expecting labor assignments or interrogations. Instead, they found tables set up with chairs, and on each table, bowls. American soldiers were serving ice cream. Nadia stopped in her tracks. Ice cream. She hadn't seen ice cream since before the war. A young sergeant walked up to her, holding a bowl. He said something in English, then the translator repeated it in Russian. "Welcome to Camp Shanks. We hope you enjoy your stay." Nadia took the bowl. Vanilla ice cream, smooth and cold. She looked around. The other women were holding their bowls, faces frozen in disbelief. Katya whispered, "Is this heaven?" Another woman, a gunner named Irina, shook her head. "No, this is America." And for the first time since her capture, Nadia began to understand. This wasn't about generosity. This wasn't about kindness. This was simply how America worked. They had so much food that they could give ice cream to prisoners. They had so much wealth that they could afford clean beds, medical care, and recreation yards. They had so much power that they didn't need to prove it through cruelty. The realization was devastating. The Soviet Union had sent her to war believing that the West was collapsing, that victory was inevitable, that suffering was noble. But standing in a New York prison camp, eating ice cream under a clear blue sky, Nadia understood the truth. The war had already been decided, not by ideology, not by courage, but by abundance. Over the following weeks, the women settled into a routine. They were given work assignments, mostly light labor, cleaning, cooking, assisting in the camp hospital. They were paid in camp scrip, which they could use at the canteen to buy toiletries, chocolate, magazines. Nadia bought a bar of soap, real soap. It smelled like lavender. She held it in her hands and cried. In the Soviet Union, soap had been rationed since 1942. People washed with ash and cold water. Skin infections were common. Hygiene was a luxury. Here, soap was sold like candy. Katya bought a lipstick. She hadn't worn makeup in years. She applied it carefully, staring at herself in a mirror. "I forgot I was a woman," she said quietly. The other women nodded. War had stripped them of so much, not just safety and comfort, but identity. But here, in this strange American camp, they were being reminded. They were not just soldiers. They were women. They were human. One afternoon, an American officer organized a baseball game. Prisoners versus guards. The women were invited to watch. Nadia sat on the bleachers, confused. She didn't understand the rules. She didn't understand why grown men were running in circles, laughing. But the energy was infectious. The crowd cheered. The players joked. Even the guards smiled. It was the opposite of everything she had known. In the Soviet Union, joy was suspicious. Laughter was frivolous. Survival was serious business. But here, joy seemed to be normal. That night, Katya said what they were all thinking. We were lied to. No one argued. By June, news of Germany's surrender had reached the camp. The war in Europe was over. The women expected immediate repatriation. They expected to be sent home. But weeks passed, and nothing happened. Nadia asked the camp commander why they were still being held. The commander, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, explained through the translator, "We're waiting for Soviet officials to come get you. We've contacted Moscow. They haven't responded yet." Nadia felt a chill. Why wouldn't they respond? The commander didn't answer, but his silence spoke volumes. In truth, Stalin's government didn't want them back. Soviet soldiers who had been captured were viewed as traitors, regardless of circumstances. Returning POWs were often sent directly to gulags. Stalin had issued Order Number 270 in 1941. There are no Soviet prisoners of war, only traitors. The Night Witches, heroes of the Soviet Union, were now considered enemies of the state. Nadia understood. She had always understood, on some level. But now the reality was undeniable. Her own country had abandoned her. One evening, an American medic named Sarah Miller sat with Nadia in the camp hospital. Sarah spoke a little Russian. She had studied languages in college before the war. "What will you do when you go home?" Sarah asked. Nadia stared at her hands. "I don't know if I have a home to return to." Sarah looked sad. "I'm sorry." Nadia shook her head. "Don't be. You gave me ice cream. That's more than my own commanders ever did." Sarah smiled. "It's just ice cream." "No," Nadia said quietly. "It's proof that the world is bigger than we were told." In late August, Soviet officials finally arrived at Camp Shanks. The women were told to pack their belongings. They were going home. Nadia felt no joy, only dread. As they boarded the transport ship, American soldiers lined the dock. Some waved, some saluted. One young sergeant, the same one who had given Nadia ice cream on her first day, walked up to her. He handed her a small paper bag. Inside, chocolate bars, soap, and a pack of cigarettes. "For the journey," he said. Nadia didn't know what to say. She nodded, eyes wet. The ship departed at dawn. Nadia stood on the deck, watching America disappear into the distance. She thought about the ice cream, the baseball games, the soap, the kindness. She thought about the lies she had lived inside for so long, and she thought about the truth she would carry home, a truth that no propaganda could erase. The journey back to the Soviet Union took 3 weeks. The ship was crowded, the conditions harsh. But Nadia barely noticed. She was preparing herself for what awaited. When they docked at Murmansk, Soviet officials were waiting. The women were separated immediately. Interrogated. Accused. "Why did you surrender? What did you tell the Americans? Are you a traitor?" Nadia answered truthfully. She had been shot down. She had been captured. She had not betrayed the Soviet Union. But truth didn't matter. Perception did. She was sent to a labor camp in Siberia, not as a prisoner officially, as a re-education volunteer. She spent 2 years there, breaking rocks, planting crops, living on thin soup and propaganda. But she never forgot the ice cream. In 1947, Stalin died. Slowly, the political climate began to shift. Nadia was released. She returned to her village, a shadow of the woman she had been. Her family welcomed her quietly. They didn't ask questions. They knew better. But one night, her younger sister whispered, "What was it like in America?" Nadia thought for a long time. Then she said, "They gave us ice cream." Her sister frowned. "Ice cream?" Nadia nodded. "And that told me everything I needed to know." Years later, in the 1980s, historians began interviewing Soviet veterans. Nadia was among them. She was asked about her time as a POW. She spoke carefully. Even decades later, talking about the West was dangerous. But she said this, I learned that enemies are not always what you're told they are. Sometimes, the enemy is the lie itself. The night witches became legends. Their story was told and retold. Books were written. Films were made. But the part about the ice cream was often left out. It didn't fit the narrative. It was too small, too strange, too human. But Nadia never forgot. Because in the end, wars are not won by bullets alone. They are won by systems, by resources, by the ability to feed your soldiers and even your enemies without flinching. The Soviet Union had taught her to fear the West, but the West had taught her something more dangerous: doubt. Doubt in propaganda, doubt in absolutes, doubt in the lies that make war possible. And once that doubt takes root, it never fully dies. If this story moved you, subscribe for more true accounts from World War II. History like this deserves to be told, shared, and never forgotten. Drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. These voices from the past still speak, and they always will.